Differences of classical and operant conditioning. In the previous videos, we have learned classical and operant conditioning and its determinants. The two fundamental theories of conditioning learning, the classical and operant conditioning, they differ in various aspects. Before we explore the difference between these two, please remember to subscribe this channel. Please see other videos in this channel and share with students and others who like to study psychology. Thank you. Let's see the origin. Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov developed and studied classical conditioning in late 1890s. He discovered it by ringing a bell every time his test subject, dogs, got food. When they were fed, they would salivate, which is a natural reaction. The dogs soon developed a conditioned response, also called a Pavlovian response. Any time the dogs heard a bell, they salivated, whether they were fed or not. So that is classical conditioning. American psychologist B.F. Skinner. He discovered operant conditioning in 1937 when studying Pavlovian response and reflex physiology. He sought to study the way learned behaviors are developed, how our behavior is modified and eliminated through consistent reinforcement and punishment. He invented the Skinner box, a chamber to expose pigeons or rats to carefully controlled stimuli. Simple, repeatable responses as well as the rate of response become the foundation of operant conditioning as a behavior measure. Skinner's theory was reinforced by American psychologist Edward L. Thorndike's law of effect theory. Now let's see how the classical conditioning and the operant conditioning works. Stimulus. In classical conditioning, it comes before the behavior. In the experiment, we can see that the stimulus, whether it is conditioned or the unconditioned, that is food or the bell, it will come before the behavior. And in operant conditioning, the behavior comes first. That is the reward or the punishment. It comes later. It is served as to reinforce or discourage a behavior. Then process. In classical conditioning, learning is possible by forming association between two stimuli. And in operant conditioning, the learning in which the organism studies the relationship between the responses and its consequences. So in the example, we can see that the dog learned a behavior by associating the two stimulus, the food and the bell. While in operant conditioning, the rat learned a behavior. That is when the green light is on and that time if it presses the lever, the food is served. So the process is different in both the conditioning. Then what it stresses on. In classical conditioning, what precedes the response, that is stressed. And in operant conditioning, what follows the response, that is stressed. That is what causes a response, that is stressed in classical conditioning. And when a response is shown, what is its consequences or what it follows, that is stressed in operant conditioning. The nature of behavior. Involuntary or reflexive behavior in classical conditioning and voluntary behavior in operant conditioning. For example, the dog in Pavlov's experiment involuntarily salivates on seeing the food and then on associating the bell with food. In operant conditioning, the behavior is voluntary. The rat in Skinner's experiment presses the lever voluntarily to receive the food. Then responses. In classical conditioning, it is under the control of stimulus. So based on the stimulus, the responses vary. In operant conditioning, the response is under the control of organism. The organism decides how to behave depending on the consequences. Then type of learning. Classical conditioning involves passive learning. The organism cannot choose to participate in the learning process. It happens naturally. The operant conditioning, it entails active learning. The organism is required to actively participate in the learning process to be either rewarded or punished. So this is how the classical conditioning and operant conditioning works. There are differences in the stimulus, the process, and the process or the area in which it stresses on, then the nature of the behavior of the organism and the responses and the type of learning, how the organism is involved, whether they are involved passive or active. So these are the differences. Now let's have a quick recap on what we have learned. We have learned the differences between the classical and operant conditioning, the origin and how each of these works. Classical conditioning is one in which you associate two stimulus, but there is no involvement of behavior. On the contrary, operant condition is a type of conditioning in which the behavior is learned, maintained or modified as per the consequences it produces. In today's world, both the classical and operant conditioning are utilized for a variety of purposes by teachers, parents, psychologists, animal trainers, and many others. The goal of conditioning is to produce some sort of change in behavior. Hope you like this video. Please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you and keep smiling.